At the end of Blood Omen 1, Kain was left the last of his kind. With the pillars collapsed and the long-held power of the Circle of Nine crumbled, it was the end of an era and the start of something new. And yet by the time we next saw Kain in Soul Reaver, he was the leader of a vast empire. Before another skip forward, that empire reduced to ruin and crumbling into dust. This time on the Arcane Tomes, we'll start to explore Kain's rise to power and his attempts to conquer and rule Nosgoth, beginning with the false start of Kain's vampire army, as seen in Blood Omen 2. For millennia before Kain's birth, power in Nosgoth had been concentrated in the hands of the Circle of Nine and the Pillars of Nosgoth. For sure, there were many kingdoms which held regional power, but the real overarching power was held in the metaphysical hub of the world and the guardians that served them. However, all this was to change with the infiltration of the Pillars by dark forces bent on their destruction. These forces were able to infiltrate the Circle itself, and through some complicated manipulations and the murder of one of the Circle, they were able to bring about the corruption of the Pillars. Kain was born to replace the murdered Balance Guardian Ariel, and was destined to take his place among the Circle as the new Balance Guardian. But he too was affected by the corruption of the Pillars, and the only way for the corruption to be righted was for the individual Guardians to be eliminated and new Guardians to be born. So when Kain reached adulthood, Death Guardian Mortanius arranged for Kain to be turned into a vampire, and Mortanius and the ghost of Ariel ensured that Kain was sent on a quest to restore the Pillars, killing each Guardian in turn and returning their tokens so that the Pillars could be healed. However, before new Guardians were able to be born, Kain had to completely restore the Pillars, and only one pillar was left corrupted. It was then that Kain discovered that he was Ariel's successor, and that only with his death could the Pillars be restored and new Guardians born. Kain refused the sacrifice, and the Pillars collapsed, supposedly damning the world to an eternal ruin. But in their passing, they left a surprising power shift in their wake. The long-standing rule of order in the world was gone, and all their power was now concentrated in the hands of a single individual who had been made immortal and was likely one of the most powerful beings to have ever existed. Moreover, in the course of his quest, Kain had also seriously damaged the integrity of some of Nosgoth's major kingdoms. He had changed history so that the all-conquering legions of the Nemesis were wiped out, their king killed, and that lineage apparently extinct, with the kingdom in ruins. The fate of another kingdom, Willendorf, was unclear after the timeline shift, but it was ruled by a king Kain saw as weak, and he had already offered Kain his kingdom. In many ways, the time was ripe for an ambitious nobleman who had gained immortality and the powers of the Circle to take advantage of the power vacuum. With the influence of the Pillars removed, and Kain's personal ambition to rule the world already established by the end of Blood Omen, the stage was set for the inevitable rise of an empire. However, in the initial years after the Pillars' destruction, very little of note happened. Demon incursions into the material realm increased, and caused the former vampire hunters of Mobius's army to transition into demon hunters. which all but confirms that the eliminated vampires were not considered a threat. At this stage in his life, Kain hadn't raised any vampires, and even believed that he couldn't do it by himself. Ultimately, Kain's unique raising meant that he may not have had knowledge on how to sire a vampire, and not having the traditional blood curse, he may not have even been capable of doing so in the traditional manner, although it's unclear whether or not he tried. So, for a century at least, Nosgoth was considered virtually vampire-free, and demons were considered the main threat affecting the humans. All of that was to change, however, with the effect of the timeline alterations caused by Raziel and Kain in Soul Reaver 2 and Defiance, echoing through time. At some point, Vorador was resurrected and raised once again by an as yet unknown party. This greatly changed the future of Nosgoth, meaning that an era that had largely been free of vampires in previous timelines was soon to be the subject of an entirely new generation of vampires. Vorador's resurrection greatly altered the balance of power in Nosgoth, and seeing how his kind had been all but wiped from the world changed Vorador's perceptions. Apparently prompted by a young and ambitious Kain, Vorador conspired with the Balance Guardian to change the fate of the world. And though it took time and energy, Vorador began to produce his own progeny to replace those killed in Mobius's crusades. Over time, Vorador's offspring were built into a formidable fighting force commanded by Kain, and a headquarters or castle built for the Order between the Lake of Tears and the Pillars. It was from here that, to match Kain's ambition, the vampires began an unstoppable march to conquer Nosgoth. It seems few of the vampires went against this, perhaps reasoning that the only way to ensure their safety after the previous crusades was to go on the offensive. Vampires that were known to have been involved included Magnus, described as Kain's champion and serving as a powerful warrior; Faustus, described as a legionnaire in the army and an indifferent soldier; and Sebastian, whose exact role is unclear, but who seemed to be one of the leaders of the army. One vampire that was known to have refused to take part, however, was Marcus, a highly respected and powerful vampire, talented at manipulation, but who had expressly turned down Kain's offer to join him. This had caused Kain to make an attempt at his life, and Marcus went into hiding. An incident which may have kept the other, lesser vampires in line. Uma was also not involved, and her descriptions implied that she was only created long after. The other members of the Cabal are less clear on their associations, although some do appear visually to have been present in some of the earlier campaigns. The campaigns of the army commenced from their headquarters, and quickly brought the surrounding human settlements to heel, apparently massacring their inhabitants. The army headed south to take Siegstrahl, and then continued on to conquer Provence. The army then made a detour to the west to raise Freeport, before turning their attention to the main prize, Nosgoth's supposed capital, Meridian, further south. However, this would not be such an easy task, because Kain's army was not the only new faction in this timeline. While Kain and Vorador had been building up the power of their army, the Hilden had been building up their own strength from a base in the Hilden city. And the Hilden general travelled to the mainland in disguise, hearing legends of an old Seraphan order who had brought the vampires to near annihilation, and hearing of a resurgent vampire threat rising, the Hilden general created a new, revived Seraphan order to counter them, and took on the guise of the Seraphan Lord. This new Sarafan grew and organised, and in time the rise of the vampires served to spur on more recruitment from the humans. And with the secret backing of the Hilden, the Sarafan were furnished with new technologies like glyph magic and magical armour, which allowed them to counter the vampire threat. But the brutal advance of Kain's army truly galvanised the human resistance, causing them to fortify and dig in around Meridian, prepared to defend it at all costs. The stage was set for a confrontation between the two powers that would decide the fate of Nosgoth. But the Sarafan Lord wasn't leaving it to chance. He brought with him the Nexus Stone, an artifact which could nullify the power of Kain's signature weapon, the Soul Reaver. He also made contact with Sebastian and appealed to his lust for power, promising him that rather than being an underling in Kain's empire, Sebastian would rule together with the Sarafan Lord in his order. This was enough to persuade the power-hungry Sebastian to betray Kain, and he arranged to walk the army into a Sarafan ambush. Worse was to follow for the army. Kain's champion Magnus slipped out of the camp in the night, intending to assassinate the Sarafan Lord single-handedly. His bid was unsuccessful, and Magnus found himself banished to the eternal prison. This left Kain without his fiercest warrior, and Kain's comments implied that he wasn't the only one to have left the camp in the night. Despite apparently having the advantage, even some of the vampires of the army had deserted the cause, perhaps giving Kain some lessons he would take forward on loyalty and betrayal. On the day of the battle, Sebastian's ambush was triggered, and the vampires found the mass ranks of the renewed Sarafan Order waiting for them outside Meridian, with the Sarafan dug in to defend the city. As the two armies clashed in the Battle of Meridian, it was the glyph magic, equipment, and training of the Sarafan that won through, and Kain was isolated from his army and locked in single combat with the Sarafan Lord on a clifftop. With Kain unable to use the power of the Soul Reaver, it was the Sarafan Lord that triumphed, knocking Kain off a cliff to his apparent demise. With the vampire army now leaderless, the Sarafan were triumphant, and it wasn't long before the army was routed. Few survived, but those that did fled for their lives. A few, like Legionnaire Faustus, were spared in exchange for hunting down the survivors of the army, while others, such as Marcus, who never officially joined the army, freely offered their services to the Sarafan and became traitor vampires. With the defeat of the army and the apparent death of Kain, his ambition to conquer Nosgoth would be put on hold, for a time at least. In one swift act, the vampires had gone from the cusp of ruling it all to once again being an endangered species, being hunted to near extinction. This time with their own kind turning against them to save their own skins. Over time, the effectiveness of vampires hunting their own would slowly whittle away the vampire numbers until once again few remained. The Sarafan meanwhile conquered Nosgoth, with the Sarafan Lord becoming an uncontested dictator, and their ironclad rule would become increasingly cruel and authoritarian and unpopular with even the humans, although dissent was swiftly suppressed. This wasn't the end of Kain's story though. The remains of the army were able to recover Kain's near lifeless body and retreated into hiding. They formed the Cabal, the vampire resistance to Sarafan rule, and worked to undermine the Sarafan at every turn. Vorador was able to create some new vampires to replenish those lost, including Uma, but it seems that he wasn't able to create them in large enough numbers to raise another army, especially with the Cabal being hunted down. And so the resistance remained in the shadows, their numbers being slowly reduced by the Sarafan hunts. 2 centuries after the Battle of Meridian, Kain was revived, although it's not clear if this was his natural recovery or if the Cabal deliberately chose to revive him. It seemed that Kain's reckless ambition may have become something of a cautionary tale, and the vampires of the Cabal were obviously warned of and intimidated by his presence and forthright attitude. Perhaps the situation simply became dire enough for them that there was no other choice over extinction. Either way, Kain quickly set about bringing the Sarafan plans crumbling down around him, setting a path of destruction and killing traitor vampires. He exposed the Hilden conspiracy, destroyed the main factory and recovered the Nexus Stone, and then went on to bring down the device, leaving the Hilden plans in ruins, all in his single-minded pursuit of vengeance against the Sarafan Lord. When Uma questioned Kain about the future, revealing Vorador's cautionary tales, Kain revelled in his plans for domination of the land. But Uma was suspicious, and believed that this would likely lead to him eliminating the Cabal, as they would be the only ones who could stand against him. She stole the Nexus Stone from Kain, but paid the price of betrayal, as Kain killed her and took back the stone. Ultimately, Kain stood alone against the Sarafan Lord, using the Nexus Stone to close the Hilden Gate and stop the Hilden invasion, killing the Sarafan Lord. And in the aftermath, he reflected on Uma's words, before finally setting his sights on building an empire anew. It's unclear what happened to Vorador and the remnants of that generation of vampires, but it appears that just as Uma had feared, none made it very far in Kain's new empire. In the wake of the near elimination of the vampires at the end of the Blood Omen era, a whole new generation of vampires needed to be created for Kain's vampire army to even exist. The troops of Kain's army were notably not the progeny of Kain himself, and it appears that Kain wasn't even able to create his own vampires at this time. Instead, it was the revived elder vampire Vorador who was the driving force behind the vampire army. In the 2 centuries after the collapse of the Pillars, an entire new generation of vampires was created, and the majority of these vampires were involved in the vampire army in some way. Here's the who's who of the vampire army. Kain was the leader of the vampire army. His position as the last surviving guardian and his ambition to rule Nosgoth was assisted in this timeline by the as yet unexplained resurrection of Vorador, who provided the vampire troops for Kain's army. Kain's reckless and authoritarian ambition seemed to be the source of some consternation with some of the other vampires, however, and this ultimately cost him, as conspiracies within lost the army the Battle of Meridian. Kain was defeated, but just barely survived the battle, where the rest of his army was massacred and defeated. Revived by the vampire resistance a couple of centuries later, Kain set on his own more personal revenge quest that unravelled the Sarafan and exposed the Hilden supporting them. Destroying both set the stage for the rise of Kain's new empire. Vorador was the patriarch of the vampire army, having been resurrected and made aware of the near extinction of the entire race at the hands of Mobius's mercenary army. The once hedonist, once resigned Vorador saw fit to assist Kain in fighting back to establish vampires as the dominant species in Nosgoth. He aided Kain by creating many new vampires, most of whom took part in the army, and served as something of an advisor, although there was clearly some friction between him and Kain. Vorador appeared to be present and planning the movements of the army, and at the Battle of Meridian. He survived the massacre, and in the aftermath of the failure of the army, he set up the Cabal as the vampire resistance to Sarafan rule. Sebastian was an ambitious vampire who served among the leadership of Kain's vampire army. However, Kain's single-minded pursuit of power and rulership of Nosgoth irked Sebastian, who sought power for himself. Ultimately, this led Sebastian to covertly conspire with the Sarafan Lord to bring the vampire army down. He set up an ambush that led to the downfall of the army, and handed the Sarafan victory at the Battle of Meridian. Sebastian defected to the Sarafan and became one of its leaders, ostensibly given authority alongside the Sarafan Lord and the highest ranking of the so-called traitor vampires. In reality, he was a pawn in the Hilden invasion. Sebastian met his end in the main factory of the industrial quarter, protecting the Nexus Stone from Kain, who was eager to gain it for his own purposes. Magnus was a powerful warrior, described as Kain's champion, who brought down the Sarafan by the score in the initial war for control of Nosgoth. However, he too appeared to abandon Kain, along with many others, on the eve of the Battle of Meridian. In reality, Magnus did not change allegiance. Instead, he attempted to personally assassinate the Sarafan Lord himself. He was unsuccessful, and ended up banished to the timeless eternal prison, where he suffered for centuries. Tortured and mutilated, he eventually lost his mind, until Kain visited the prison and mercifully dispatched his former champion. Faustus was described as a legionnaire in Kain's army, but Kain himself described him as an indifferent warrior. Faustus fought in the vampire campaign and in the Battle of Meridian, but when the tide of battle turned, he was captured by the Sarafan. In the aftermath of the battle, Faustus became one of the so-called traitor vampires, offering to assist the Sarafan in tracking down other vampires and pledging himself to the Sarafan. He tracked Kain after his revival and met his end at Kain's hand in the smuggler's den. The other members of the Order are somewhat unclear, and their inclusions can be somewhat contradictory, particularly between the intro cutscene depicting the Battle of Meridian and the action as described in-game, although this could well reflect Kain's flawed recollections when he's revived, as this is how the intro is framed. For example, the traitor vampire Marcus is depicted as present in the march of Kain's army preceding the Battle of Meridian. However, dialogue in-game reveals that while Kain approached him to join, he refused, and Kain made an attempt on his life in retaliation. The scripts make it even clearer that Marcus was not part of the army. The injured vampire seen later as part of the Cabal appears to be present at the Battle of Meridian, but Kain shows no acknowledgement of him when they meet later, and it's unclear if this was literally intended to be the same vampire or to represent another. Similarly, the bald Cabal vampire is another that appears to be present at the Battle of Meridian, but is not addressed or acknowledged by Kain when he visits the Cabal headquarters at Sanctuary. Indeed, Aside from Vorador, few members of the Cabal seem to have been part of the vampire army, and it's unclear if any were even alive at the time. Notably, Uma was explicitly not part of the army, and was only turned after. The rank and file of the army is represented by simplified models which resemble Sebastian, despite Sebastian himself apparently turning on the Order and presumably not being present in the final confrontation. The vampire army was developed solely for Blood Omen 2, and in many ways their conception was the result of the team attempting to bridge the gap between Blood Omen 1 and Soul Reaver 1, with the former leaving off with Kain apparently on the rise to control Nosgoth, and the latter beginning with the Empire at its height before showing its fall. For example, the team was keen to show the decaying industry scene in Soul Reaver at its height, and so Blood Omen 2 gave them the opportunity to explore and fill in the gaps. Of particular interest was the length of time it took for Kain to raise progeny of his own to begin his rise to power. A 500-year period where very little seemed to occur in the wider Nosgothic history. This blank canvas gave the team an open book to explore, and in many ways build experience for Kain that would colour his later character in Soul Reaver. Indeed, many design issues were overcome by allowing Kain to begin to develop a precursor army that would be defeated. It allowed the team to create a worthy foe in the Seraphan Lord. It provided Kain with personal motivation in revenge and recovery of the Soul Reaver. It explained the loss of abilities from Blood Omen and allowed the developers to create their own. It explained the differing look and feel of the game. And finally, it allowed for more basic player training. Fans have often noted parallels between the story of Blood Omen 2 and Soul Reaver, with both having the rise of an aggressive vampire power helmed by Kain and assisted by important lieutenants who go on to become antagonists that must be defeated and their powers absorbed to gain abilities. The implication being that in-universe, the vampire army acted as something of a flawed trial run for Kain, a prototype and failure that he learnt from when he moved forward with a more successful version. Highlighting these parallels, the symbol used on the banners of the vampire army was Kain's clan symbol. This symbol had first appeared in Soul Reaver 1 as a symbol of Kain and his empire from that game, but this appears to imply the symbol was previously used for Kain's army too. The symbol was designed by Daniel Kabuko, and its crown is representative of Kain's arrogance, while its fangs signify his vampiric nature. In-universe, the origin of the symbol is not necessarily clear, but it seems likely that it was based upon Kain's family crest, which can be seen in his crypt in Defiance. In the intro cutscene, Kain and Vorador are briefly shown in a fortified location overseeing a map and planning movements of the army. Here, the standard of the army, Kain's symbol, is shown in a location between the pillars of Nosgoth and the Lake of Tears, implying that this is the location of the headquarters of the army. And the path of conquest of the army stems from there. Kain's description in the Blood Omen 2 manual, apparently narrated from after his revival, states that his castle lays in ruins, potentially suggesting the structure was destroyed after his failure. Comparing the stories of Soul Reaver and Blood Omen 2, it seems the biggest lesson that Kain took forward was one of loyalty. Vampires created by Vorador had, in various ways, failed and betrayed him, and resulted in his vision of empire laying in the dust. But more than that, it had taken vampires to the brink of extinction once more, with only a few vampires left by the end. and few that would seem to be likely to take kindly to Kain as their ruler. Uma had taken this to mean that Kain would seek to have them eliminated as a threat. And given that there's no trace of a Vorador helmed clan in Soulweaver, she may well have been correct in that assumption. But there were at least some caveats that were planned, with the cancelled Defiant sequel The Dark Prophecy planning to explore the issues between Vorador and Kain left over from Blood Omen 2, allowing Vorador to survive his somewhat ambiguous fate from the end of Blood Omen 2 and be summoned by the Elder Kain, a meeting which only allowed suspicions between the two to grow. Finally, it would potentially have left the door open to an exiled Vorador or his lineage to survive in some form into the age of Kain's empire, albeit greatly removed from the empire itself. Either way, when Kain gathered his strength and plans for his next attempt to take Nosgoth, a century after the collapse of the Hilden invasion, he took a different path. He learned a new, unique method to raise vampires for himself, so that each would be indebted to and loyal to him. This time, he would raise an empire to dominate Nosgoth. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of the Arcane Tomes. Join us next time as we explore the unstoppable rise and fall of Kain's empire.